sunny spaces, smiling faces, happy places. But every sunny space holds a shadow. Behind every smile are sharp teeth, and every happy place has something sinister lurking just below the surface.
Welcome to We Saw the Devil, the podcast diving deep into the chilling realms of true crime. Join your host Robin as she unravels mysteries that have left investigators baffled and armchair sleuths obsessed. Be forewarned, dear listener. We Saw the Devil is not for the faint of heart. Our unflinching exploration will take you to the darkest corners of the psyche and through the unimaginable depths of human darkness to unearth stark secrets to the harsh light of day. Nothing will be left untouched. Are you ready? Are you sure? We saw the devil.
Hello, everyone. You are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin, and I am here with a new episode. I've been really excited for this one. It's a relatively newer case for me. I was going to put it out last week. I announced it, and then we went into verdict watch. I thought for sure on Friday that a verdict would be read, but oh no. No, 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 no. No verdict on Thursday, no verdict on Friday. In fact, the jury is deadlocked. The judge told them to take lunch and go figure it out. And we're going to be heading into Monday, and I wonder if we're going to get a verdict on Monday. Picture this: a woman, her life entangled with a police officer, stands accused of the unthinkable, using her own black Lexus SUV as a murder weapon against the man she loved and leaving him to die in a blizzard. Was it a tragic accident shrouded in confusion and covered up by police corruption? Or was it a calculated act of violence fueled by perceived betrayal? Apparently, the jury doesn't even know because, again, they are currently deadlocked. And I'm not envious of their decision here whatsoever. The prosecutors say that the defendant backed her SUV into her boyfriend while dropping him off at another Boston police officer's home following a night of drinking. Then she supposedly just left him to die in a snowstorm, in a raging nor'easter, in fact. The defendant's attorneys say that she's being framed in widespread cover up among law enforcement and local influential families. And much like the notorious case of Michelle Carter, which also took place in Massachusetts, an incredible number of text messages are at the heart of the evidence, and they are salacious. This episode is about Karen Reed and her former boyfriend, police officer John O'Keefe. And I have to say, I haven't been this interested in a trial in years. Not even Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, any of that. But this trial is fascinating in a way that the Michelle Carter case also fascinated me as well. If you don't know much about it, I hope that you will also go down the rabbit hole with me on this one. I can't even think of the last time that I've seen a defendant plead not guilty to all charges and claim police corruption and cover up. I mean, not only that, but the text evidence doesn't really paint any of the law enforcement personnel in a good light either. And you guys also know how juries work. Considering that many of the officers were called as witnesses, that's a giant green check mark in the column for the defense. So, does Karen Reed have a chance at beating these charges, or will she be convicted? She was charged with second-degree murder, punishable in mass by life in prison with the possibility of parole. She also faces lesser charges of manslaughter while operating a vehicle under the influence, punishable by 5 to 20 years, and leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death, which is punishable by up to 10 years. In short, the TLDR is that she is up against a lot of prison time. And people feel so strongly about this case that there's even a free Karen movement where supporters agree that she's been framed. I mean, it's absolutely wild. I haven't seen this in quite a while. And when I made the post on Instagram announcing this episode, a couple of you commented and said, yeah, none of you think that she should be or will be convicted. And that does seem to be a pretty general consensus from what I've seen online as well. A lot of people are thinking that she may just beat these charges. But we are going to get into all of that. First, as always, let's just get the quick housekeeping out of the way. You're listening to We Saw the Devil. If you're not following on social media, please do so. You can follow the show at We Saw the Devil Podcast on Instagram, Or if you like me and want to follow me, you can follow me at Robin_WSTD. Fair warning, I pretty much just post pictures of food and dogs. The next episode is actually going to be an episode on the trial portion of the Karen Reed case. This is more or less a part one. We're going to go through what transpired, the events leading up to the trial, and then part two is actually going to be what happened during the trial and the evidence that came out, why the jury is struggling with their decision. Following that episode, there will be the Chris Chan episode, and that entire series is finally drawing to a close. I know I've said it once, but I'll say it again, and this time actually mean it with conviction and say it with my whole chest. I am back full time with the podcast, so make sure you're following on at least Instagram. That's the primary. I am working also for it on a new website, so that should be up in the upcoming weeks. There's just so much going on in the world right now, and I want to talk about all of it. I mean, I don't know if you guys have recovered from the debate at Shady Pines the other night, the presidential, I use that term loosely, debate Shady Pines the other night, but oh my God, I don't know how many of you are just kind of defeated at the moment, but let's focus on true crime and more interesting things here. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please take 20 seconds out of your day to leave a 5-star review on iTunes, Spotify, whatever platform in which you're using to listen to this. It means a lot and impacts the administrative side of the show in terms of sponsors and things like that. But let's go ahead and get into it. So, Karen Reed and John O'Keefe both met in their early 20s in 2004 and briefly dated. The relationship did not work out due to poor timing, and then they each went basically off in their own directions to pursue different paths. Karen became a college professor, and James went on to become a police officer. They reconnected on Facebook in 2020, and Karen Reed really admired the fact that John was taking care of his sister and brother in law's children after their parents tragically died. His sister died of a brain tumor, and then her husband, 2 months later, died from a heart attack. So John O'Keefe ended up taking care of his niece and nephew. After reconnecting, they soon began to date again. At that point, Reed was an equity analyst and adjunct professor at Bentley University who lived in Mansfield but ended up spending most of her time at John O'Keefe's home helping with the kids. And their relationship was not without its own issues. Back in 2021, the couple went on a New Year's Eve trip to Aruba with roughly like 70, 75 friends and family, mostly from John O'Keefe and the police officers, law enforcement. Well, one night, John was drinking in the pool bar and began to make his way back to his hotel room. As he made it into the lobby, I mean, he was drunk, kind of wobbling all over the place, apparently. He saw the younger sister of one of his friends as she was coming out of the elevator. And by her account, John was more or less wasted. He leaned on her, and then she pointed at his hotel room, like the general direction of his hotel room, and gave him directions to it. He then kind of sauntered away. Now, at that exact moment, his girlfriend, Karen Reed, was coming out of the lobby and saw that exchange. Well, she ran over to John publicly and screamed, "Who the fuck was that?" And he explained, "Hey, it's just the sister of a friend." Karen then turned around, cursed at the girl, and then she and John returned to their hotel room where they argued and screamed at one another for about half an hour in front of John's minor niece and nephew. They were minors. Well, later that evening, John disappeared entirely and refused to answer Karen's texts. And that was New Year's Eve. And he ended up missing New Year's Eve and ringing in the new year with her. She had returned to the room to celebrate it with the kids by herself, and he was off doing whatever. And the entire relationship, as you'll come to learn via witness statements and text messages, was rife with accusations and acts of infidelity on both sides. And because of the sheer volume of cell phone data present in this case, we have near minute to minute knowledge of what transpired. So let's begin 2 weeks before John O'Keefe's death. And here's the thing, too, you guys, and it's really interesting. And I know it's about framing, too, right? About true crime cases. It's kind of the joke about she lit up the room every time she walked in. Everyone loved her. There's almost always this designation. The victim is almost always just kind of like elevated and, put on a pedestal in a way. And I understand why, why it's framed that way in the media. But in this case, no one's really great. Like, no one is actually an astoundingly amazing human being, and I don't think anyone really lights up a room here. So it's interesting. But on January 12th, 2022, again, January 12th, 2022, Karen Reed obtains the cell phone number of ATF agent Brian Higgins. And the two of them flirt via text message. And then Karen goes to his house 3 days later on the 15th to watch a New England Patriots football game. As a former Mainer, go Pats. But after the game, as she's leaving, she kisses Brian Higgins. She then later returns to his home a couple days later. They apparently discuss their feelings for one another, whether they wanted to pursue a relationship. Higgins would later testify in the trial recently that they did not kiss again and that they had no intimate contact whatsoever. Now, this happened while Karen Reed was still in an active relationship with John O'Keefe. So she obtained a cell phone number of someone that she found attractive, kissed him, and he was a friend of her boyfriend, by the way. Brian Higgins knew John O'Keefe. A couple days later, on January 28th, Karen and John were consistently in texting quarrels. At one point, she asks him to tell her if he's interested in someone else, and he replies, quote, "Things haven't been great between us for a while." John invited her over to his family's home, but Karen refused because she just didn't want to deal with his family. Later that evening, a group of Boston police officers returned from a trip to New York City where they had attended the funeral of an officer who had been killed in the line of duty. These officers were Brian Albert, Kevin Albert, Brian Higgins, and Eddie Hernandez. And they first went to a local pub before heading over to another bar called Waterfall. Also on the 28th at around 7 p.m. that evening, John O'Keefe texts Karen that his nephew is at a friend's house and that he wanted to go out for a drink. Karen replies that she's having an issue with her water heater and asks a plumber who lived in her neighborhood to come take a look at it. John tells her not to worry about it at that time and to come meet him instead, writing, quote, "Hope your plumber buddy that you quote unquote texted is hot." He then offers to look at it for her, but Karen says she'd rather wait for the plumber. Karen and John end up going, getting dinner, having a drink, and then the group of police officers that I mentioned before, they were at Waterfall, and so they texted John and asked him to meet them there. So around 11 p.m. on the evening of the 28th, Karen and John joined the group at the bar, and Higgins, again, our dear ATF agent Brian Higgins, also friends with John O'Keefe, sent Karen Reed a flirtatious text message as she was sitting there with John, Brian's friend and her boyfriend. Now, to her credit, Karen did not respond or reply to that text message. Now, a little bit more about the people in attendance. So, Chris Albert was a town selectman. Brian Albert was a Boston police officer who leads the fugitive apprehension team, and he was also featured on the show Boston's Finest. Also, there was Brian's sister in law, Jennifer McCabe. And this is more or less the core group of people of interest and of note for this case. At the bar, John drank beers and Karen drank multiple vodka sodas, 5 of them to be exact. A little after midnight, both groups end up leaving the bar. Many from the large group of officers end up going to Albert's home at 34 Fairview Road. I know this can be a bit confusing, but bear with me, it'll get easier as we go. But 34 Fairview Road, many from that original first large group of officers ended up going over there to continue to drink and party. They invited Karen Reed and John O'Keefe. Karen did not want to go, but apparently told John that she would drop him off. And surveillance footage would actually catch her black SUV at multiple locations across Canton, the town where this transpired, on the way to that home. Around 12:18, John called and asked for directions to the home. At 12:30 a.m., other guests were arriving. Now, snow is coming down. If for any of my fellow New Englanders out there, it was a day where there was a nor'easter coming through, so lots and lots of wind. The snow is coming down, but people who were arriving testified that they saw a black SUV pull up to the front of the house. A woman was driving, and there was a man in the passenger seat. Now, John O'Keefe's cell phone records record him taking 36 steps and traveling 85 feet. Roughly 5 minutes later, as some of the guests were departing, they see a black SUV pull away with only a woman inside, and she's driving. They did not see anyone else in the vehicle and did not see any sort of body on the lawn. Now, what happens next is a series of interesting moves and text messages between all parties involved, and there's a lot of GPS evidence as well. At 12:36 a.m., Karen Reed's cell phone automatically connects to the Wi-Fi at John O'Keefe's house. She calls him, the first of more than 50 phone calls she makes to him between this time and 6:08 a.m. Again, over the course of about 5.5 hours, she calls him more than 50 times, getting more and more and more agitated and irate. One voicemail that she ended up leaving said, "John, I fucking hate you." At 12:59 a.m., she left John a voicemail saying, quote, "John, I'm here with your fucking kids. Nobody knows where the fuck you are, you fucking pervert." 1:11 a.m., she leaves a voicemail for him that says, quote, "It's 1 in the morning. I'm with your fucking niece and nephew, you fucking pervert. You're a fucking pervert." 7 minutes later, she leaves another voicemail telling him that she's going home and accuses him of being with another woman. Again, for like the 80th time, she calls him a quote, "fucking pervert." Between 1:30 a.m. and 2 a.m., the last of the guests leave the gathering at 34 Fairview Road. One guest saw a black blob on the lawn and remarked on it, but no one investigated further or got out to see what it was. And this is of note. At 2:22 a.m., Brian Higgins receives a 1-second call from Brian Albert. Again, Brian Higgins, remember, Brian Higgins is the ATF agent that Karen Reed kissed and was one of John's friends, recall. So Brian Higgins receives a 1-second call from Brian Albert, and then 17 seconds later, he calls Albert back. That call lasted 22 seconds. Higgins ended up denying making those calls or even speaking to Albert at that time, and both of the men said that those calls were butt dials, quote unquote butt dials. Now, I waffled on including this in this episode or the next episode when we talk about the trial, but I think it's worth noting here. At 2:27 a.m., according to the defense and digital investigator Richard Green in the trial, Jen McCabe searches "how long to die in cold" on her cell phone. Again, Jen McCabe searched, quote, "how long to die in cold" on her cell phone at 2:27 a.m. that morning. She denied making that search at the time. That being said, two digital forensics experts who testified for the defense both determined that at 2:27 a.m. she opened a browser on her phone to search for a local sports league that her children play in, and that the timestamp of that search was from when the tab was opened, not when she actually made the search. So, that I know that that has been brought up constantly online. You know, why at 2:27 a.m., but way before the body was found, way before anything happened, did this woman who was present at the home search "how long to die in cold"? So, just wanted to make that clear. At 2:30 a.m., a plow driver came down the street. He knew the family. The Alberts were very, 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 very well known and well connected family. And from what I've gathered, based on people who live in the area and what they've been saying, a lot of these people, like Jen McCabe, the Albert family in particular, John O'Keefe, I hate to simplify it this much, but there are people that are well connected, you know, the attractive, popular, well connected, a little bit more wealthy people, right, in high school and whatnot. Everyone knew them. They lived there. Canton is apparently a town where like 98% of the people, they grow up there, they stay there, they die there. So they were very well connected and very, very well known. So at 2:30 a.m., a plow driver came down the street, and I think he saw like an extra car or something, and he kind of ignored it or something. Anyway, he did a favor for the Albert family because, again, he knew them, and he did not see a body on the lawn at that time. 4:30 a.m., Karen Reed says that she woke up alone in the same clothes from the night before on the couch at John O'Keefe's home. And John O'Keefe was not there. So she goes to John's niece and tells her that, hey, he didn't come home last night. Can you try to get in touch with him? So the niece, again, a minor, texted John and also did not receive a response to a text or a phone call. Karen didn't have Jen McCabe's number or any of the other people's phone numbers, I guess, except maybe for Brian Higgins. So at 4:53 a.m., John's niece calls Jen McCabe. Karen didn't have her phone number, so she had the niece call her. So the niece called Jen McCabe and told her, "Hey, John didn't come home last night. He didn't return home." So Jen McCabe spoke briefly to the niece and then did end up talking to Karen Reed, and Karen agreed to come over to Jen's house. 5:23 a.m., Karen leaves a voicemail for John saying, "John, where are you?" At 5:30 a.m., we go back to the plow driver, Brian Loughran, and he testified that at this time, he returned to the Fairview Road Albert home and was unable to go past Carriage Lane because the road was blocked off by first responders. Now, prosecutors said in the trial that because there were no first responders at the scene at that time, that his account of that is inaccurate. So at 5:35 a.m., Karen Reed arrives at Jim McCabe's home, and then Carrie Roberts arrives soon after. Now, Carrie Roberts is a friend of John O'Keefe. Carrie Roberts actually previously dated John O'Keefe's best friend, who was also a police officer, and he had ended up, they dated, and she got pregnant with his baby, and then he committed suicide. So Carrie Roberts remained friends with John O'Keefe and a lot of the other officers. She was very involved with her friend group, and they actually assisted and kind of helped her and, like helped with the kids and stuff like that, basically gave a support system to her. So Karen Reed, Jen McCabe, and Carrie Roberts. They end up going to John O'Keefe's home to look for him there. Obviously, he wasn't there. While they are there, though, Karen Reed shows Jen McCabe and Carrie Roberts her broken tail light on her SUV. Why? I don't know. Like, why would you show them that? But I don't know. I digress. But they obviously do not find John O'Keefe present at the home, at his house. He never came home. So they then go back to 34 Fairview Road. At 6:03 a.m., Karen Reed says that she sees John outside on the lawn of the Fairview Road home. She jumps out of Carrie Roberts' car. Carrie and Jen leave the car in the middle of the street, and they run up with Karen Reed to the lawn, and they find John O'Keefe still alive but completely unresponsive. Karen races towards him. She drops to her knees down beside him. She's screaming. She frantically moved the snow. It had been storming, again, a nor'easter. So he's covered in snow. She clears the snow off of his body. She lifts up their shirts. She gets on top of him. She tries to warm him up. Blood is coming out of his nose and mouth. His right eye was black and swollen. And of note, too, is that his baseball hat and one of his sneakers were also missing. Jen McCabe ran back to the car. She grabbed blankets and then she put blankets on top of him, and they dialed 911 officially just 1 minute later at 6:04 a.m. 6:30 a.m., ATF agent Brian Higgins is woken up by phone calls from the Canton police chief Ken Berkowitz and Brian Albert. He initially ignores the first phone call from Ken Berkowitz, but does in fact answer Brian Albert, who tells him what happened, that John O'Keefe was found deceased. Higgins gets dressed and drives to Fairview Road. Jen McCabe then walks up to the house, knocks on it, tells Brian and Nicole Albert, "Hey, John was found dead on your lawn." At that point, police show up and they begin to interview people, specifically Jen, Brian, and Nicole in the home. And while that's going down, John O'Keefe is taken away in an ambulance to Good Samaritan Hospital. Now, also interesting is that Carrie Roberts offered to drive Karen Reed to the hospital, but they got a call from Karen Reed's mother, and Karen said that she should be involuntarily hospitalized. So Carrie Roberts ends up turning around and going back to the house. At 6:47 a.m., John O'Keefe arrives at the Good Samaritan Hospital via the ambulance. His body temperature at that point is 80.1 degrees, and he is in cardiac arrest. At 7:50 a.m., John O'Keefe is pronounced dead. Just a minute later, Karen Reed arrives at the hospital via an ambulance as well. 8:30 a.m., Julie Albert arrives at 34 Fairview Road to drop off Dunkin' Donuts for Brian Albert Jr., and that's when she learns that John O'Keefe is dead. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. 9 a.m. that morning, Everyone is aware that John O'Keefe is dead. Karen Reed is in the hospital, at the Good Samaritan Hospital as well. So Jennifer McCabe calls Officer Lank and asks him to come back to 34 Fairview Road. Via her testimony, she tells them that she heard Karen Reed say, quote, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." However, according to the defense team, she heard her say, "I hope I didn't hit him." Which one is true? We do not know. At 9:03 a.m., a blood alcohol test is ordered for Karen Reed to test for alcohol and recreational drugs. What was in her system? Her blood's drawn at 9:08 a.m. and arrives in the lab 5 minutes later. And at 9:53 a.m., the test comes back and shows that she was at 0.093. 0.093, and the Massachusetts legal limit is 0.08. So that much later in the morning, hours after she'd likely consumed alcohol, she was still blowing at 0.093. She should never, ever, 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 ever have been on the road or behind a wheel. And this is when we have the state troopers enter the picture. At 10 a.m., we have troopers Bucknick and Proctor. And State Police Trooper Michael Proctor is a name that you are going to want to remember for the next episode, and especially. So Bucknick and Proctor arrive at the Canton Police Department and they speak to other officers there, basically just to get some information about what's going on. They're filled in. They go to the hospital to interview the first responders who are on the scene. They see John's body. They collect his clothing as evidence. And then they go to Jennifer and Matt McCabe's home to interview them. And during that interview, Brian Albert arrives and is also interviewed. At 1:19 p.m., Trooper Proctor called Karen Reed from his personal cell phone. That information was not shared with the jury during the trial. 1:27 p.m., Karen Reed makes a Google search on her phone for DUI lawyers. That information was also not shared with the jury. So 2:15 p.m., Carrie Roberts was actually interviewed and talked to a TV news station. Like, she did an interview about what had happened. Matt McCabe, and this involves that first initial larger group of officers and family and friends initially, right? The large group that was at the home. Matt McCabe sends a group text message saying, quote, "Tell them the guy never went in the house." Brian Albert responds back and says, "Exactly." Jennifer McCabe says she's telling them everything. At 2:30 p.m., Bucknick and Proctor arrive at Karen Reed's parents' home to interview Karen and seize her cell phone and car. They leave 2 hours later with her SUV on a tow truck. At 4:56 p.m., Lieutenant Kevin O'Hara of the State Police Special Emergency Response Team arrives at the home on Fairview Road, and another officer arrived as well to do an evidence search. An hour later, there are 7 police officers on scene going through the home and the yard looking for evidence. They conclude their search about an hour later. A little after 6:15, when they finish their investigation of the property, the state police troopers meet at the Canton Police Department and they all collectively debrief on the case. And the Canton Police Department actually recused itself from the investigation due to, obviously, John O'Keefe. And then they began to go to work on the evidence. About 10 p.m. that evening, they laid John O'Keefe's clothing out to dry because it was soaking wet from the snow. They laid it out on butcher paper at the Canton Police Department to let it dry out. And then also worth noting, and this is what I'm going to talk about more in depth in the next episode on this, but at 10:53 p.m., Trooper Proctor actually is discussing the case with his personal friends in a group chat. He tells his friends that Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe with her car, and Brian Albert, the homeowner and friend where John was found, like on his lawn, had absolutely nothing to do with the death whatsoever. So Trooper Proctor was telling his personal non-law enforcement friends about the case and the evidence and what was going on. The next day, on January 30th, Brian Higgins, our ATF agent friend, asks a friend who works in a local FBI forensics lab advice on how to extract data from his own cell phone. He brings his phone into an FBI kiosk to extract those text threads that he had had with both Karen Reed and John O'Keefe in order to give them to the Massachusetts State Police as evidence. On January 31st, the autopsy was completed on John O'Keefe's body. Dr. Irini Scortibello determined that O'Keefe suffered blunt force trauma to the head before becoming hypothermic and was not involved in any physical altercation before his death. The manner of death, however, is undetermined. The next day, on February 1st, Michael Proctor, he was again discussing this case with his personal friends. He was making fun of Karen Reed. He called her a cunt. He called her a whack job. He then also texted his sister and told her that Julie Albert wanted to give him a gift for his assistance with the case. What was he assisting with? I'm not usually one to insert myself into the narrative, but what exactly was he assisting with? Also on that day, Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab forensic scientist Maureen Hartnett, she goes to the Canton Police Department and she does a full analysis of Karen Reed's SUV. And from the SUV, she ends up recovering a hair and several pieces of glass from the rear of the car and removes the broken taillight. Investigators at this point are also not finished with the home at 34 Fairview Road. And it's also shown during this time that Matt McCabe drove by the home and saw that investigators were out on the lawn, and he actually ended up texting Brian and Nicole Albert, the homeowners, to let them know. Karen Reed was officially arrested and arraigned on February 2nd, the next day, on the charges of manslaughter, motor vehicle homicide by negligent operation, and leaving the scene of personal injury or death. Now, Karen's primary attorney that she had hired at this point, his name is David Yannetti. And as David Yannetti was on his way home from the arraignment, he apparently received a phone call from a tipster. And this anonymous man had previously called his office and then requested a call back. So he called him back. Initially, this man gave David a fake name, but he ends up telling Yannetti Karen Reed is innocent. John was beaten up by Brian Albert and his nephew. They broke his nose. And when John O'Keefe didn't come to, Brian and a federal agent dumped his body on the front lawn. Again, initially, this caller was anonymous, but David Yannetti did end up identifying the man. The man did actually, well, he was forced to hire an attorney. That attorney ended up making a statement that Yannetti, the attorney, that his version of events with that completely incorrect, that the man never told him that. It's curious, right? So Karen Reed's attorney, after she was arraigned, ends up returning a call of some random tipster who tells him, hey, she's innocent. I know what happened. John O'Keefe was beaten up by the Albert family, and they ended up dumping his body when he didn't come to. So, given that information, that's when David Yannetti and Karen Reed began to kind of suspect, apparently, if you trust that version of their event, their version of events, that she was being framed. What's fascinating is that they actually hire a private investigator to go door to door throughout Canton. And a lot of the people were scared to talk. They turned them away. But there was one person, one resident in the town. His name is Tom Beatty, and he was a friend of both John O'Keefe and Karen Reed. He ended up telling this private investigator that his daughter, who was friends with Brian Albert's nephew, Colin Albert, said that Colin had been at 34 Fairview Road the night that John O'Keefe died. Two things here. A, that tipster said that Brian Albert and his nephew beat up John O'Keefe, and then a federal agent helped dump his body. So that kind of confirmed in a way that the nephew was there potentially. But then also it supposedly helped jog Karen Reed's memory that during spring of 2020, one night she and John O'Keefe were in bed. His security alarm started going off in the middle of the night. So he jumped out of bed to see what was going on. And then Colin Albert and other teenagers were out on his front lawn saying, go fuck yourself. And Karen Reed remembered John screaming, get the fuck out of here. And apparently the next morning, they woke up and there were like a dozen beer cans all over their lawn in the bushes. And they didn't call police. But apparently at that moment is when John O'Keefe and Colin O'Keefe more or less had beef. They more or less hated each other. And to Karen Reed's recollection, Colin was the only person that she was aware of that John ever had any problems with. A little time after that, Karen Reed and her father actually went to David Yannetti's office to meet with him. And that was when David Yannetti showed her, it was the first time that she saw pictures of John's body. She said that she basically had a breakdown after it because it looked as though someone had, quote, beat the shit out of him. And apparently he had black eye, swelling. He had an injury on his arm, and the wound on his arm was particularly intriguing. Karen was talking to her mother about it, and she was describing the injuries. Her mom asked, could that be from an animal? So Karen Reed ended up calling Tom Beatty. Remember that one guy who confirmed that Colin Albert was, in fact, at Fairview Road. And she's like, hey, do the Alberts have a dog? And he said, yes, a German Shepherd. A couple months later, Karen Reed was having lunch with some friends. They had actually been summoned to testify in front of the grand jury originally. They were friends with both her and John. And they mention and they tell her that State Trooper Michael Proctor, again, our, friendly trooper, had actually been friends and known the entire Albert family for years. So all of these series of events, the anonymous tipster, Tom Beatty, the random resident who knew that Colin Albert had been present at the home, that he had previously had issues with John O'Keefe, that Karen was there the night that he apparently, Colin showed up and, trashed and screamed at him in the middle of the night. All of these things basically at that point, they were starting to come together and kind of form a narrative of, I might be being framed here and this might be a cover up. There's also a really great interview. Karen Reed did a lot of interviews. Like she came out of the gate. And I think that the presentation and kind of the choice that the defense team made has been really, really, really intriguing. The way that she's carried herself. I mean, let's be honest, y'all. She's not likable. I mean, I lived in Maine for like 16 years or something heinous, and let me tell you, she is just straight out. She should have a t-shirt, the black t-shirt with the white font that says straight out of Mass. Like she is definitely a Massachusetts resident. Love it, love it, love the attitude. But she very much, has that kind of like very strong, abrasive, tells it like it is personality. So that's kind of been fascinating to watch. But she did a really, really great interview, like more like a blog article, where she talks about her entire experience with this. And this was pretty much the time when it was a shower thought of where she was like, holy crap, I'm being framed. And this was kind of the time that happened. The following day, on February 3rd, Bucknick and Proctor go to the Fairview Road home and they do another evidence search. Now, this time they find John O'Keefe's baseball hat and they find a cocktail straw and pieces of broken glass and plastic. Now, when they left Waterfall that night, John O'Keefe actually walked out of the bar holding a cocktail glass. Like he literally just walked out with it. We'll talk more about that in the next episode when we talk about the trial and stuff that they discuss in the trial. But they found the baseball hat that was missing, a cocktail straw, and pieces of broken glass and plastic, which I can assume at this point most likely was the tail light. Bucknick and Proctor also interview Brian Higgins on that day, February 3rd. And Higgins came prepared. He had printouts and digital copies on CDs of all of his text conversations with Karen Reed and John O'Keefe that he himself extracted from his cell phone. They also again interview Nicole Albert and Brian Albert. Later that day, Canton Police Chief Kenneth Berkowitz drives by the home himself just in happenstance to see if, the snow had melted. It gotten a little warmer, as is New England weather. So he drove by the home to see, hey, some snow has melted. Maybe there's something more that we missed. And they actually found more glass there. And they found more pieces of plastic on February 8th, 10th, 11th, and 18th. So lots of plastic found at the scene. Also on February 4th, our friend Michael Proctor, state trooper, texts his sister, quote, hopefully she kills herself. Again, the state trooper texted his sister, hopefully Karen Reed kills herself. On February 26th, Colin Albert is photographed out and about with friends in a Boston area bar. And in that photo, his knuckles look like they have actually been cut up, like they were injured. They had some sort of trauma. Albert would go on to testify in the trial that he'd hurt his hand when he fell walking up an icy driveway. However, the defense implied that that injury very well could have come from a fight. And here's where it also kind of gets juicy. So in April, Karen Reed at that point had pretty much accepted the fact that she was more or less about to be fucked. she needed some firepower on the defense team to really have some sort of chance at this. So she starts to Google and she comes across criminal defense lawyer Alan Jackson. No, not of Chattahoochee fame, but Alan Jackson, a defense lawyer who's defended Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey both. This is also part of her blog article that she did, which is fantastic. But she was trying to come up with a headline, a subject line of her email that would get his attention. So the title of the email was "Murder of a Boston Cop." That apparently worked. It got his office's attention, and then shortly thereafter, Karen Reed, her dad, and David Yannetti, her other attorney, got on a conference call. Um, David Yannetti had already sent over the autopsy, and apparently, according to Yannetti, Alan Jackson said, quote, "How the fuck are they saying he got these injuries?" Because again, John O'Keefe, he had injuries. He had black eyes, a swollen, contused face. He had gashes all over his arms that appeared strange. And supposedly, Alan Jackson more or less agreed that it looked like he'd been beaten up and then attacked by an animal, and that he didn't really appear to have just been hit by a car. So, in any case, he officially joined the defense team and then more or less began kind of exploring this particular theory that John O'Keefe went into the home, was attacked by the Albert family, attacked by their dog, and then they went outside and dumped his body on the lawn. And Ellen found a lot of weird and shady happenings. And some of this is based on text communications, the supposed butt dials between Albert and Brian Higgins the night, during the time that John O'Keefe was apparently supposedly on the lawn. The German Shepherd that the Albert family had. I mean, I'll go over all of this in part two. And I suggest if you're interested in this, you listen to that. I'll go over this evidence more in detail. A dog that was gotten rid of, a German Shepherd that was rehomed very, 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 very soon after this particular incident. The home was almost immediately sold. People got rid of their phones immediately, or magically their phones weren't working. Also, again, that search that Jen McCabe made, well, that search actually appeared again 2 more times. And Jen McCabe said that Karen Reed asked her to search for it. I mean, so much weird shit happened and came out during this discovery phase. Alan Jackson submitted a 92-page affidavit to the court, basically laying out the entire theory created by the defense team that Karen Reed was innocent, that he was actually killed in a fight, beaten, attacked, and left outside to die in a nor'easter. Laid it all out. So June 9th of 2022, Karen Reed is officially indicted by a Norfolk County grand jury on charges of second-degree murder, manslaughter while operating under the influence and leaving the scene of a personal injury or death. On August 16th of 2022, Michael Proctor is granted a search warrant for Karen Reed's cell phone. And he partially searches the phone before it's basically snatched away because of, her attorney basically got it revoked. But he does, again, text that wonderful group of friends he has and laughs and jokes about going through her phone searching for her nude photos. Proctor is a real stand-up citizen and someone you really want to be a state trooper in charge of a potential homicide investigation. And here's what's really, really interesting. On September 15th of 2022, the defense filed a motion for a court order instructing Brian Albert, Julie Albert, Colin Albert, and Brian Higgins to preserve their cell phones and all of the data on them. A week later, Brian Albert went into a cell phone store, said, "Oops, my cell phone broke a couple weeks ago. I need a new one." And he ends up trading his cell phone in for a new one. A week later, Brian Higgins changes his cell phone carrier and also gets a new phone and phone number. His excuse for this is that some random person involved in a case he was investigating found his personal cell phone number weeks before, and he just now decided to change his cell phone. So we have Brian Albert got a new cell phone like a week after the defense filed for a motion to preserve it. We had Brian Higgins changing cell phones and getting a new one as well. It's really, really, really bizarre. And then in November of 2022, Brian and Nicole Albert list their home at 34 Fairview Road for sale. Now, as is the case with true crime in 2024, I mean, Cases blow up literally in a matter of hours if they're covered on YouTube or TikTok. Some people take an interest in them. They can blow up in a matter of hours with hundreds of thousands, if not over a million views. Well, there's a blogger by the name of Aiden Kearney, and he's known as Turtle Boy. And he had a blog and also a YouTube channel. So in April of 2023, he basically creates a blog and starts posting about how Karen Reed was framed. And he discusses this as basically a police cover up. And he begins to communicate with Karen Reed through a friend and ends up communicating with her defense team. Now, if you follow the Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow case, you know that there's one in particular, YouTuber who used to go to the witnesses and the people involved, on the periphery of the case, and he would harass them and he would ask them questions and show up at their home and things like that. Well, Aiden is very much he likes to provoke. He even calls himself an entertainer. He's like, I was born to do this. And he just doesn't give a shit. And he actually went to Jen and Matt McCabe. He went to their child's lacrosse game and he actually ended up confronting them and posting that confrontation on YouTube. And that majorly went viral. He titled that video Canton Cover Up Part 1. Corrupt state trooper helps Boston cop cover up murder of fellow officer, frame innocent girlfriend. Now, the media itself, proper media, say like in this case, Boston Globe, Boston Herald, legitimate news publications. There's a level of integrity, right, that journalists must utilize when they tell stories. But influencers and bloggers aren't held to that standard, really. And Aiden Kearney, basically the same. Complete clickbait headlines. He began live streaming talking about it. He called it the Canton cover up. He would have at least like two videos every week on YouTube. And he was starting to get tens of thousands of views per episode. Like this was starting to make national waves instead of being a more state or regional type of interest. On July 22nd of 2023, so last year, Aiden organized a rolling road rally where he tried to get protesters to drive past the homes of witnesses in the case, like Brian and Nicole Albert, Michael Proctor and his wife, Jen and Matt McCabe, and the Canton Police Department, Thomas Kelleher, as well as the Canton Police Department as a whole. He was basically a one-man organizer getting this Free Karen Reed movement up and off the ground right off the bat and putting that narrative out into the world. The trial hadn't even happened at this point. So naturally, with all these blogs, tens of thousands of people watching this on YouTube, starting to talk about it on TikTok, there are countless TikToks on this as well. I mean, this is really where it kind of grew teeth and grew up into something very public. And on that same note, by October 10th, 2023, Aiden Kearney is arrested and arraigned on witness intimidation charges because he was going all in, calling, asking neighbors, having people walk by, harass them in public. So he's finally actually arrested and arraigned in that and spends a little bit of time in jail. I believe, he was in jail for about 2 months because he was finally arrested as well on assault and battery charges. Those charges were dropped, but he did end up remaining in jail for 2 months for the witness intimidation, which is just wild. In January of this year, January 5th of 2024, Karen Reed's defense team filed a motion to dismiss the case, and the judge came back 2 months later denying that motion. And then we head into the trial. So in middle of April of this year, the jury selection began. April 29th, the trial officially began. And June 21st, the prosecution rested. 3 days later, on the 24th, just last week, the defense rested its case. The deliberations began the following day on the 25th after the Commonwealth and the defense gave their closing arguments. And as it's the 29th now, a Saturday, we're in the weekend. Maybe Monday. Maybe we'll hear something Monday. Don't know. Like I said in the beginning, y'all, I do not envy this jury whatsoever. And there are so many questions here in this case. Excited to talk about the evidence found on both sides in the next episode because it's really interesting when you go into a trial and you know that the entire purpose is to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, right, that X, Y, or Z happened. And there's a lot of doubt in this. There's a lot of doubt. And it may seem as cut and dry as, okay, he was in the car, then he wasn't in the car, her tail light's broken, and there's hair and, whatnot on that in the broken tail light area. It's pretty cut and dry. But the thing about it is that a good criminal defense attorney can plant that seed. And not only have they majorly planted that seed, they, went out, got the private investigator, they went out, interviewed people, they have gotten information and crafted this narrative of he could have been beaten and dumped. This could be a cover up. That's wildly interesting to me. So I have no idea how this is going to turn out. I know that based on what I've read, based on what I've watched and read and the evidence presented to me, what I find so fascinating about this case in particular is that the defense team, Karen Reed's defense team, has done something that is so freaking rare. You do not see this every single day. They have no obligation to prove or show that someone else committed this crime, right? The defense team has no burden to do that. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think that Karen Reed is innocent. I think she did it. I think that she was trashed and I think she ran him over. I don't believe personally in this theory of police corruption and cover up and this, that, and the other. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter. It does not matter whatsoever because that's not the purpose of the defense team. The purpose of the defense team, obviously it's nice if you can prove that your client is innocent, but it's to prove that there's reasonable doubt of her guilt. And it just so happens that their narrative behind the reasonable doubt is they're claiming that the police did it. This other magical person who came in and did it, law enforcement in this case, they're claiming law enforcement and that law enforcement committed the crime and then covered it up and then followed up by trying to frame her for it. And we see this all the time, right? Someone gets arrested for drug possession. I didn't have that. The cops planted that on me. The cops did it. I didn't do this. The cops are dirty. O.J. Simpson pulled the same thing, right? With the gloves and all of that. But it's so hard to pull that off. And the fact that it's happening in this case is absolutely insane. And her defense team has been just chef's kiss of going and doing the grassroots legwork at getting and uncovering inconsistencies and really strange circumstances, and then also shitty police work. They got the top witnesses in the fields of, what they were looking at. So say, for example, one particular witness, what we'll discuss, analyzed the health app on John O'Keefe's cell phone to basically, because it shows if you go, how far you go, it shows you walk, change in elevation, how many steps, so forth. The defense team actually utilized that cell phone data, looked at the numbers, got a top expert in it, and then utilized that evidence to say, look, John O'Keefe was in the basement of that home at Fairview Road. All the while, the prosecution is saying, no, John O'Keefe never made it inside. They had top experts analyze the wounds on John O'Keefe's body, saying that they were consistent with a dog bite from a dog the size of the ones that the Alberts had in the home. The one that they had to rehome because guess what? Plot twist. The dog had a bite history. It had bitten people previously. So John O'Keefe ended up dead with strange wounds on his arm. Shortly thereafter, the Albert family rehomed their dog and said, oh, well, it has a history of biting people. The thing about it, there's so much hateration, holleration in this dancery that who knows what's true? You know what I mean? So I guess just for me, the highlight of this case has really just been seeing the defense team at work. It's actually really brilliant. And I'll just say it right now. If I were on the jury, I would vote absolutely not guilty. Just because there's no way that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she is solely responsible for it. And when you think of the perspective of a jury and how they feel about this, right? State Trooper Michael Proctor sending text messages regarding the case he's working, that he's investigating to his group of friends and sister and family, calling Karen Reed a cunt, talking about how he was when he was supposed to be looking for evidence, he was looking for her nude photos in her phone, the butt dials at weird times, right? When a potential altercation could have taken place. And let's be honest, police officers, even off, like, you're not going to have two grown men in the middle of the night each butt dial each other, right? Like, that's not a thing that's going to happen anymore in 2024. So I digress, y'all. Really excited for this verdict. There are certain cases where my heart sings because I feel like the right decision is going to be made. And this is going to be very, very, very unpopular opinion. Please don't come for me. I know. But in the Casey Anthony trial, I believe they made the right decision. Does it suck? And do I think that she was responsible for her death? Yup. Yup, I do. But the thing about it is that it's proof that the justice system can sometimes work. And as fucked up as our country is right now and can be, has been, probably always will be, there are little glimmers of hope in our legal system at times when it's clear that the beyond a reasonable doubt is actually working. And so I think that, I'm hoping at least, that that's the outcome we're going to get with this. But I guess we will just have to wait and see. But that's it for today, guys. Thank you for listening. I know this episode was more of just a generic timeline, but I just wanted to go through the major chain of events before we get into the trial coverage. So there's at least, kind of a foundational understanding there. Next episode is going to be the trial coverage. Again, then we'll get into the Chris Chan. We're going to finish that up and then get back into straight true crime. Again, if you're not following the show on social media, make sure to check out Instagram for up-to-date news. That's We Saw the Devil podcast. And if you're interested in My Dogs Are My Food or me, you can follow at Robin_WSTD. Until next crime.